Hi everyone! So today I'm going to be talking about this little part here, this little intricate, interesting shaped part called disconnector. In a CZ world we call it disconnector, in a Tanfoglio world we call it interrupter. The part does the same functions in both guns. It's everything about double action with this part. So what I'm going to be covering here today is what is this about, how does it work, what modifications you can do to it, and how they affect your trigger pull. If you're not interested in learning anything more about the disconnector, if this is too much for you, that's probably not the video for you. If otherwise you want to just learn more, just for curiosity, or if you're just thinking about adventuring yourself and doing some modifications, some upgrades, etc., this video could be some good information for you. So let's start. Alright, so to begin with, this is what I'm going to be working on. I have a almost stock Shadow 2 compact. I have a fully modified Shadow 2 full size and another modified Shadow 2 full size that I'm going to be using the three of them to show you, to do comparisons between the trigger pull and kind of hopefully give you a good illustration of what each of the functions and modifications you can do in the disconnector, how they affect the trigger pull and your trigger on the gun. So with that said, where is the disconnector in your gun, and what are the functions that it plays in it? So the first thing is to bring us all to the same page. This is where your disconnector is going to be in your gun. It's attached to a hammer. The hammer basically has two attachments, one for the disconnector or interrupter, the other one for the hammer stud. Reinforcing this one more time, this is not the case for a single action only gun. This is just for double action guns. A single action gun will be the same thing without the disconnector. So it's just the hammer and the hammer stud. So the disconnector plays basically two main functions on the gun, both in double action operation. So the first we're going to talk about is, see this face here, this kind of a hook shape of the disconnector. It attached to here's a trigger bar with the trigger shoe in the other end. It attached to the back of the trigger bar in this little notch that it has here. It goes there and attached right there like so. Right, so this way you have your hammer attached to your trigger bar when the trigger is in double action position. Why it attached there? Because then when your gun is operating, is cycling, so you got here, that's how it is in the gun. You got the hammer, you got the disconnector, and the disconnector is hooked to the trigger bar in the back. When the gun is cycling, when the slide is going back, it's pushing the hammer back, it's recocking the hammer, and then therefore when the hammer goes back, it will also pull the trigger bar along with it. If I just pull here, the disconnector is going to slide up and not pull the trigger bar because there's nothing keeping pressure on the disconnector. But if I put my finger here and then I wanted to look at what happened to the trigger bar and then pull it, trigger bar comes along. You see, trigger bar is coming back with the hammer. So that's the first function of the disconnector. Without the disconnector, the hammer would be cocked and the trigger would remain in a double action position. That doesn't prevent the gun to work, but it wouldn't be ideal, right? We're pretty far from ideal having that much take up until your trigger bar eventually engages with the sear and it becomes basically a single action gun at that point. So that's what the first function of the disconnector is for. The second function, also for double action. Everything I'm going to be talking about here is double action. So there's this little edges here that you have on the side, in each side. The OEM disconnector, the stock disconnector has edges on both sides. The aftermarket disconnector, some of them have an edge only on the right side. So let's talk about what that edge does. So see the trigger bar here? There is this other area here, this other depression here. Kind of it fits that, it matches that face of the disconnector perfectly. So the disconnector that hook goes in, and now you have those two edges right there, touching that edge, touching that depression or that area in your trigger bar, right? Why that is important? Because now it's kind of the opposite situation. It's not when the hammer is pulling, the hammer is going back, pushed by the slide, and then the hook of the disconnector is pulling the trigger bar along, right? But what if the gun is really double action, hammer down, and your trigger is forward? So to fire a shot at that point, when you pull the trigger, now that hook has no function because it's not pulling the trigger bar. Right now you have the trigger bar pushing the hammer back, and the way that's going to happen is via this engagement here, right? So if you look at here, same thing there. That's the disconnect. This is an aftermarket disconnector, like I mentioned. Just have that edge, that little tab in one side. It doesn't matter because the trigger bar has in both sides, so as long as there is that engagement, it will work. So when I pull the trigger back, see, the trigger bar is then pushing the disconnector, and it's in turn pushing the hammer back when I pull the trigger. That's what that edge in the disconnector is for. The third area we're going to talk about in the disconnector is basically this. You can see here the way it goes, it's not really straight. It has a little bump here at the end. It's kind of a curved actually. It has a little bump in the beginning where it connects to the hammer, and at the end of it here, and then let's call it the nose of the disconnector here. This bump has a function as well. The way it works is it rides the disconnector. Your disconnector rides underneath your sear cage, like that, right? You have the hammer in this position, underneath it connected to the disconnector, and then when the hammer is going back and forth, it is the disconnector is riding in that, kind of this area of the sear cage here. You can see there is like friction marks here. Those are made by the disconnector, by that nose of the disconnector. So why is that important? Because if I just, like I was trying to show you guys before, if I just, without the sear cage here to put that positive pressure down the disconnector, the engagement is not positive enough between the disconnector and the trigger bar. So when the hammer goes back, I wanted to notice that the disconnector is just going to lift, and then just the hammer is going to go back. The trigger bar is going to be left behind. See, it's not working. It needs to have that positive pressure down to keep a positive engagement between the disconnector and the trigger bar, so it operates like it should. Okay, now that we are on the same page in terms of how the disconnector works and what each of these areas do in the double action function, let's talk about how your trigger feels and how the trigger operates differently depending on how each of these areas is dimensioned. So look at this, is an unmodified Shadow 2. Basically, there's very few modifications in this Shadow 2 compact, so that's an OEM trigger. The first thing I'm going to talk about is the take-up or pre-travel in double action. This one has a modification to remove the pre-travel basically from double action. I'm going to talk about it, but let me show you first what is that take-up, what is the pre-travel that every double action gun is going to have. So as we talked about before, the disconnector hooks on the trigger bar via this face of the disconnector, right? You got that. And then once it's there is a distance that it needs to travel between when it's engaged with the hook and when engaged with the tab. Like if you look at here, is this distance that I'm talking about here. This is going to translate into pre-travel or take-up in double action. I'll put this better here. That distance there. There is no way to cut this by modifying your disconnector, because no matter what you do to the disconnector, there will be always a distance between the engagement with the hook and the engagement with the tab, and that's going to always translate into take-up or pre-travel in double action. The way you cut take-up or pre-travel in double action is via this little set screw here that you don't have on your OEM trigger. You need to use an aftermarket trigger, or in this case, this is a modified OEM trigger that has that set screw in the top. Your OEM trigger out of the box only has this set screw in the face here that is supposed to control post travel. So that's kind of a, it controls how much your trigger goes back after it breaks, after the hammer drops. So it kind of gives you a little bit of a shorter reset if you adjust it properly. And then the top one, in this case, like I said, this was a drill and tap into the OEM trigger. The top one controls that pre-travel. So as you can see here, I don't know if you can see in the camera, but the frame, the trigger touched the frame, and that's what stops the trigger from moving forward. And then at that point, it's engaging with the hook of the disconnector, and the trigger needs to move back to cover that distance between the hook and the tab, like we talked about. If we put a set screw here, and if that set screw is beyond the surface of the trigger here, then the set screw is touching the frame as opposed to the trigger itself, which is pushing the trigger back a little bit. So pushing the trigger back a little bit cuts that pre-travel, because you then have your trigger bar is not necessarily touching that hook anymore. Now you pushed the trigger bar back a little bit, like you can see here. And you cut, if you want to, you can cut 100% of the pre-travel, although I don't recommend doing that because you might have some reliability issues. If that trigger walks a little bit out, you're gonna basically won't reset anymore and it will stop working. So you wanna leave a little bit of pre-travel, minimum pre-travel, to make sure it's reliable. But that's how it works. That's how you take the pre-travel of the double action. It doesn't have much to do with the disconnector. One thing the disconnector does, though, one role it plays in that is, if you look at this hook here, so you can imagine that the wider or the more mass you have in this area here towards the back, the more it will, when it hooks to your trigger bar, the more it's going to pull the whole trigger bar back, right? So if you look at in the gun, like if there is more mass under that hook, it will push my trigger bar, it will force my trigger bar to go back a bit to engage with the disconnector. What that does is the trigger reach. So let me get the other one, I can show you. So this is the OEM one. I want you to notice how much distance there are here. I can get my whole pinky through it, right? When I go into the modified one with an aftermarket disconnector and an oversized disconnector, I cannot even go to the first knuckle of my pink here. So you see there's a much shorter distance between the trigger and the back of the gun. Then you can see, if I can put them side by side, maybe it's gonna be better for you to see. It's hard in the camera, but there's about, like in this case here, is about 7 to 8 millimeters. You can get anything between 5 and 10 millimeters distance cut when you use an aftermarket disconnector. Given that the aftermarket disconnector is going to have this area wider, more material here. The other thing this area, this hook, the other function is going to play, and now it comes a little bit of contradiction because I said it is used only for double action operation. It's true, it's only for double action operation. In single action, you don't have a disconnector at all. But when you have your double action system, it's not just the disconnector that is there. It's not just that difference. Your trigger geometry here, it's also different, right? So because of that, when you are in single action, you might have more pre-travel than you would like. And that's similar to the situation you had before between the hook and the tab, except that now it's between where the trigger is in the back with the hook holding it back and the sear, the engagement with the sear, and this side here, the trigger bar. So it's the same theory. You have more material here, and then this is gonna pull your trigger bar back, cutting out the take up or the pre-travel in single action. So if you look at the difference here, put this in single action, you got this much take up, see a decent amount of take up here until it breaks, and you go to a heavily modified one, and you got basically like almost half of that take up is gone. Again, you can, if you get an oversized disconnector, an oversized aftermarket disconnector, you can fit it to, if you want, to eliminate completely take up in single action. My personal preference, I like a little bit of take up, just for reliability purposes, right? So it's still about this hook area. We talked about position of the trigger, so shorter reach in double action when this is wider. We talked about less pre-travel take up in single action. This needs to be fitted correctly though. If you get a oversized aftermarket disconnector that is like really oversized and it won't fit in the gun, it won't make the gun work, what you're gonna face here is the primary symptom, which is normal, and it's like you see these in instructions of how to to install the disconnector and such, is that because this area is too wide, it's pulling your trigger bar back too much, and therefore your trigger is not able to reset in single action. So the trigger needs to go after the slide cycles and you release the trigger again, it needs to go back to the original position a certain amount to be able to, a minimum amount to be able to reset. If this hook is too large and it's pulling the trigger bar too much backwards, it will not travel enough forward to reset, and then you're gone. Like the symptom is it doesn't reset in single action. It's normal, and all you have to do is fit this area, basically remove material from here until it eventually gives enough slack to the trigger bar to reset in single. The next area we're going to talk about is this edge, right? And when you're pulling the trigger, we talked about this, when you're pulling the trigger in double, the trigger bar is engaging via that tab and pushing the whole system back, pushing your hammer back, cocking your hammer and letting it, then it slips under the trigger, the sear cage, and it drops your hammer and you fire a shot. That's how it works. So what happens with this tab, and how it can be modified to give you any kind of a difference in the trigger, etc. So the way this happens is, if you have this, if this is oversized, they normally don't do that on aftermarket disconnectors. It's basically all really about this hook here, but often it's a mass production gun, so they're not really identical to each other. So you might have one that just doesn't work. The symptom is going to be if this doesn't have, like, has too much material, or the angle is not correctly here between the engagement in the trigger bar and the disconnector. What's going to happen here is you're going to pull the trigger all the way back and your hammer never falls. So it's like the hammer follows the trigger, but it doesn't fall. So you can't really, the gun really doesn't operate as it should. So what you have to do in those situations is you have to work in this tab, either side or both sides actually, on the OEM disconnector, although you would never need to do that in the OEM disconnector. But on the aftermarket disconnector, you got to work on that tab and kind of remove material from here until remove material, and you can also kind of work in a secondary angle here in this area to actually make the trigger bar slips under the disconnector and release the hammer at some point. It's a timing needs to be correct, because if you do something wrong here, if you remove too much material or you put a secondary angle here that is not really, it's too aggressive, you can have the opposite problem. You can have the hammer falling too prematurely, too soon, which in this case, what's going to happen is it will put your gun in double action again, as opposed to the hammer fall all the way, hit the firing pin. It's just going to, the hammer is going to, that first, second set of hooks, the pre-cocking set of hooks, the hammer is going to get caught on it. And then if you pull the trigger again, you happen the same situation happening in a cycle, right? Just pull the trigger, the hammer falls, get back to the pre-cocking, pull the trigger, hammer falls, get back to the pre-cocking. You never really fire the gun. And it's all about this area and engagement that it has with the trigger bar. Okay, last thing about this disconnector is that little bump that you have in the nose of it that I mentioned. It rides underneath your sear cage. The sear cage is there, or ejector, how they call this in the world. It's just gonna push it down. It will be there pushing your disconnector down so everything works as supposed to. What people would do with it is they will polish this area on the, because there's friction here, as you can see. So they'll polish this area in the sear cage, or they will polish the nose of the disconnector here in the hope that that will be a more smooth pull in double action. You have to be careful in doing so. It does produce the result that you're looking for. It's going to give you a little bit smoother trigger pull. The same way when you polish those tabs that are in contact with the trigger bar. The hook doesn't really matter much, because you're not really feeling the hook engaging with the disconnector at any time, engaging with the trigger bar at any time. This is just when the hammer is going back, when you're pulling the hammer back, so you're not really pulling the trigger at that moment. But when people are working on this, they need to be careful, because what can go wrong here is if you take enough material from this area and it's not producing the force, the down force that it needs to produce to keep the hammer, to keep the trigger bar and the disconnector engaged, right? Just showing up. This engagement here is gonna, the down force here keeps this engagement positive. If you take enough material from either or both, the sear cage, the underneath the sear cage, or the bump, the nose of the disconnector here, you can have a situation where there's not enough force, and again, your your hammer is gonna, the trigger bar is going to disengage with the disconnector too prematurely, and your hammer is gonna fall prematurely, and not really, the gun won't operate accordingly. All right, so the last thing, and I failed to mention this when we were still talking about the hook of the disconnector. So here we go, is your reset. Right, so your reset is a function of where the trigger, when you pull the trigger, where it breaks, where the hammer falls, how much it travels back, and then when it resets, how much it travels forward again until it resets. So you have two things you need to work on that will create a better reset for you. And I'm talking about this, right? If you look at the reset here on the stock Shadow 2, I'm holding the trigger back, how much it travels forward until it resets, then that much pre-travel that we talked about. Do it again. So it travels forward a good amount, and then there's this much pre-travel, right? If you look at one that has an aftermarket disconnector, it already reset. That's how much it travels forward. So it's almost nothing. It's basically a reset, basically like a 2mm reset is probably what we have here. And there's almost no take up here until it breaks again. So this is a function of the hook, as I said, how wide this hook is, as I said, to eliminate that pre-travel in single. And then the other thing is the set screw, the post-travel set screw that you have. Let me get the OEM trigger here. The OEM trigger comes with that set screw there that you need to adjust it back to make sure your trigger doesn't travel too much beyond the point that the hammer breaks. You have to be careful with this adjustment, because too much of it and your hammer won't fall. Basically, you're gonna pull the trigger and the hammer's not gonna fall. Not enough of it, it's not gonna cause any issue to the gun, but you're gonna have more more post-travel than you want, and a longer reset. So basically that's how it works. I do recommend when setting up adjusting these two set screws, everybody in general use like blue Loctite. I do recommend to use red Loctite here. Once you get the position that you want, make sure you leave a little bit of pre-travel just for reliability. Put some good red Loctite there. I know red Loctite is permanent. You need to use heat if you need to remove that, but guess what? You never need to remove that again. Once it's set up correctly, if you don't do it the very limit at the very edge, like leaving no pre-travel at all or no post-travel at all, then you're probably never going to need to touch that again. And if you need to, it's just a little bit of heat. There is no plastic. Everything here is steel. Nothing's going to really be damaged if you put a little bit of heat in the trigger shoe to manipulate those set screws again. But at least with the red Loctite, you kind of almost eliminate the chance of having an issue with your gun operating, while you're playing with it. So that's it. That's all I believe you need to know about what a disconnector is, what it does in the gun, what modifications you can do to it, and how those modifications result in a different effect or a different feel in your trigger. So I hope this has been useful. Thank you for watching.